My name is Nicholas Mirzoeff, and I'm really, really delighted to be here. You know, you always have to say that, but in this occasion, it's actually true. There's an amazing project going on here. I'm very happy to be a part of it, even if it is close to the end. And I want to thank all of you for coming on such a beautiful evening. Would prefer to be outside myself, but here we are in the belly of the Leviathan. So without further ado, I'm going to begin. There'll be lots of images. You can follow along through the translation, or if you can manage my English, then you can listen in to me. So my question tonight is going to be a simple but difficult one. What is to be done about whiteness? So let me at first make clear what it is that I am and am not discussing. Whiteness, in my view, is an infrastructure of power. It's not a virus or a pathology, but it's a material process that classifies people as white or not, and then separates them by means of fences, walls, or financial divides. The resulting distinction structures the imagination so as to make it seem right. It becomes aesthetic. Whiteness is so ineffably and profoundly attached to the beautiful that the British Museum curators had the Parthenon marbles over here that they stole from Greece, scraped in the 1930s because they were not white enough for their taste. And it was enough in the 1970s to merely say black is beautiful, to challenge not just the aesthetic order, but the structures of power. The whiteness is not attached to individual bodies, even for those who identify as white. Now, of course, you might say, I'm Italian. But whiteness is not necessarily attached to that. For example, in the United States, from 1924 to 65, Italian immigration was severely restricted because Italians were not thought to be properly white. In my own case, I grew up in the United Kingdom, where I was white when compared to black British populations, and I benefited from the associated privileges. But when compared to the white whites, like Boris Johnson, the persistent return of the question, but where are you really from, showed that I was not really white. But then again, as soon as I arrived in the United States, I was white, simply by virtue of not being visibly African American. And South Africa, under apartheid, where these distinctions were highly visible, showing you here from the Apartheid Museum in South Africa. It was actually possible to legally change your racial classification, allowing certain so-called colored people to become white. However, it was also the case that, as it says here, whiteness does not include a person who, although in appearance obviously a white person, is generally accepted as a colored person. So in that circumstance, acceptance overrides obvious appearance. But the question is, acceptance by whom? Here, the answer was the apartheid regime. In general, the answer is systemic whiteness, which is always white supremacy, produced by infrastructure and material divides and sustained by the imagination. This production of whiteness has been a matter of law in the North Atlantic world since the 1661 Act for the Better Ordering and Governing of Negroes, Indians, Mulattoes, and Mestizos, which was passed in Barbados, which was then the wealthiest sector of the British Empire. Racial capitalism depends on this naming and ordering of visualized distinction throughout the period of coloniality, which is the time since America was constituted as the first space-time of a new model of power. So this ordering division produces what I call white space. This space is given depth by the formation of whiteness as the apex of a racial hierarchy, and by extension as a form of wealth within racial capitalism. The mapping of that space was and is made by borders and landmarks. So here I'm showing you Patrick Henry on the top here, who is one of the founding fathers of the United States, as they call them. first post-colonial governor of Virginia, saying to the First Continental Congress in 1774, and I quote, "Government is dissolved. Where are your landmarks, your boundaries of colonies? We are in a state of nature." So that is to say, by implication, colonial government is boundaries and landmarks. From the anti-colonial perspective on the bottom here, Frantz Fanon saw the same colonial infrastructure, which he called, though, a world compartmentalized, Manichaean, immobile, a world of statues. The world of statues was produced by a set of visualized distinctions based upon the colonial claim of land and its division. And that ordering was in turn sustained by what Fanon called the aesthetics of respect for the established order. So today, statues, museums, and the aestheticized border, the border which is right and therefore beautiful, are the markers of that order. So you may be thinking, yes, we know all this, and perhaps we do, although it's always a question of who that we might be. Let's distinguish, though, between knowing and realizing. So it's a commonplace that history does not guarantee progress. We know that. Yet so many of us have been shocked to see the return of racist reaction around the world that it's clear we did not realize the possibility that history might play out otherwise. Again, I know I have white privilege. Yet even as a follower in the Black Lives Matter movement, I had not fully realized what that meant. In 2015, let's get that one, this chap, the writer Garnet Cadogan, highlighted all the things that he, as an African American, could not do in New York City, where I live, and he had just moved. And these included run anywhere or carry anything in his hand, because it might be taken to be a gun. Now, I was at that time commuting, and every day seemed to find me running to the subway, carrying my phone in my hand to check the time. Now, I thought I was just late, but listening to Cadogan, I realized I was unconsciously exercising white privilege. So now I walk, and I miss a few trains. But more to the point, I act and write directly now about whiteness and its infrastructures. Anyone can say, I am not a racist. It's an easy thing to say. Much more difficult question for myself and to you is to say, what is anti-racist and what is anti-racist visual activism? Now, the work of such activism is to create an anti-racist visual environment, a different realism than that Fanon spoke about, the established order. In this kind of activism, those who are designated not white are, of course, crucial because they are unwilling experts in whiteness and what it does. Undoing whiteness is nonetheless, first and foremost, the work of those of us identified or identifying as white, but of course it cannot be exclusionary because that's the very nature of whiteness itself. Anti-racist visual activism involves then knowing how racism works, how to create an anti-racist way of seeing, and above all, a certain humility. So I'm offering here a set of starting points on my own anti-racist journey that must intersect with many other journeys that are not mine to walk. So to start with the first, I use the term visual activism in homage and lineage of the South African photographer Zanele Moholy, whose work I'm showing you here. Moholy uses photography to make herself and other South African LGBTQ people visible and levelly human. For while the South African Constitution guarantees all manner of rights, daily life in the townships is marked by homophobic and heteronormative violence. Moholy's success has taken her away on many occasions, and she has developed a new practice of self-portraiture, with the pieces being named after her destination. So here, in 2015, she was in Charlottesville, Virginia. As she often does, she has rendered herself darker in the portrait than she actually is, evoking the writer Zora Neale Hurston's saying, quote, "I feel most colored when I am thrown against a sharp white background." The white linens and needlework that enclose the space that we see here are not neutral, but are structures of settler colonialism. She's photographing herself just a few meters from where Sally Hemings, who's the African-American enslaved person with whom Thomas Jefferson had a long relationship, where she once lived. Moholy holds up a mirror to herself in the photograph, twice. Once as the subject of the photograph, and once, of course, as the photographer. Now, what those of us who see the photograph see is not what she saw in either role, double consciousness, doubled. She lays down here some markers for us. The polite and the police are close. The anti-racist way of seeing cannot be simply that of the colonizer co-opted, but it must be refracted. Gender, sexuality, and violence are all always present. And so let's go and interface now the events at Charlottesville in 2017 around the statue of Robert E. Lee, the general. So we're going to interface that statue in a moment with the work of Rhodes Must Fall in South Africa, and I want to see them as part of the same movement. Lee's statue became a flashpoint as part of a process of challenging racist and racial monuments that flowed from Global South to North. It was dedicated originally in 1924, after 3 years of organizing by the Ku Klux Klan in the area, with funds raised by a group who are called the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So that same year, 1924, panicked by the assertion that there were thousands of white people in the state with some African-American descent, Virginia passed the Racial Integrity Act, which I'm showing you here. And what that does is it prohibits marriage across the so-called color line. So whiteness, remember, is always heteronormative and patriarchal. The statute, the law, embodied the eugenic theory that there were three kinds of whiteness. Nordic whiteness was the only true whiteness, while Alpine and Mediterranean whites were to be restricted from entering the US or from marrying Nordics. And this remained the law until 1967. The Reed-Johnson Act was also passed in 1924 at federal level, and it severely limited immigration in order to promote this eugenic way of thinking. From 1901 to 1914, there were about 200,000 Italian immigrants to the United States every year. But after this act was passed, only 4,000 per year were admitted. That's a drop then of 98%. These restrictions, again, did not end until 1967, during the civil rights movement. Today, the Trump administration evokes that 1924 act as an inspiration for its own efforts to limit immigration. So the Lee statue is not artwork or even simply propaganda. It forms part of the infrastructure of whiteness, mapped in part by 700 Confederate monuments that remain in place across the United States. These monuments are a kind of archaic database. They store and preserve norms of white supremacy in relation to gender, sexuality, and migration. Now, in 2015, students from the University of Cape Town in South Africa forced the removal of a statue of the imperialist Cecil John Rhodes from their campus. It's important to remember that the protest actually began with this gesture that I'm showing you here, which is a man called Chumani Maxwell, and he's throwing human waste onto the statue. This waste was collected in a township called Khayelitsha, it's up here, an informal settlement on the edge of Cape Town, where over 1 million people live, 99% black South Africans. In that town, 75% of people share these chemical toilets, which are supplied by a private company. Now, these are often broken and unsanitary, so access to these facilities is dangerous at night, and people keep waste inside their own space, providing the raw materials for the action. Activists later stated that the protest was about, quote, human dignity for the black people living in shacks, much more than it was about the university. Now, the statue is now gone. This is the statue being taken down in April of 2015. But infrastructures issues remain acute for the South African majority. This action crossed the Atlantic 2 months later, when the Lee statue in Charlottesville was tagged Black Lives Matter. So if you're sharp of sight, you can just still see the outline on the base here, although it was erased almost at once. So the incident makes Lee's statue fully visible, which concluded in a vote in 2017 to remove it. That in turn prompted the largest gathering at the far right in recent history, leading to the murder of a protester, Heather Heyer, and Trump's now infamous statement that there were very good people on both sides. Now, the reverberations, it's important to note, have not stopped. In April 2019, Charlottesville High School had to be closed due to a credible mass shooting threat against Black and Latinx students from a white student. When former Vice President Joe Biden declared for the presidency, again in 2019, he cited Charlottesville as his reason. Just this past summer, a judge refused to allow the city to remove the statue, claiming that statues, quote, do not speak of hatred, but people do. So if you live in the United States, this is a tweak on the defense of gun ownership, where people say guns don't kill, people do. A few days later, the statues were again tagged, you can see here, with the date 1619, which is the first landing of enslaved Africans in Virginia. So we might then ask Grace Lee Boggs' famous question, what time is it on the clock of the world? It's 1619, it's 1924, and it's always 1492. The many active times in this overdetermined present preclude any effort to see the world through a single frame. For there has been a potentially revolutionary shift in objective global conditions since the 2008 financial crisis. A majority of people now worldwide now live in cities for the first time in history. Most of that growth has been in informal settlements like Khayelitsha, which shelter 25% of the world's population, and most people are under 30. That's usually not true in Western Europe and North America, but we are exceptions to the global rule. Now, clearly, there's no majority rule for this new majority, and that is the potential revolution. But from Lebanon and its ongoing uprising to Hong Kong's people power and the general strike in Barcelona, this majority is asserting itself. People thought that change would be enabled because 54% of the world's population also now have access to the internet. The internet certainly allows for new forms of connection, but also for enhanced surveillance and censorship. Inequality has reached heights not seen since the Gilded Age of the 1890s, with the 1% themselves now in awe of the 0.1%. These new parameters are not those of the received universal, which the university studies and the museum archives. That universal is the singular world of the powerful. But as the Zapatistas understood, the world we want is one where many worlds fit, and that would enable anti-racist realism. So as what Fanon called the established order falls under question, so too do its aesthetics, as sustained by the museum and the monument and the border. According to newly revived racial theories that underpin white supremacy, statues are flesh and mind. In his 1801 study of human nature, the French naturalist Julien Joseph Verret claimed to discern 3 distinct human species. He depicts the orangutan on the lowest level, below the African, all topped by a depiction of the classical sculpture known very well to you, of course, because it's here in Rome, as the Apollo Belvedere. Mirzoeff on the right here. So sculpture depicts absolute whiteness, because no individual body could fully express it. Now, to me, what that means is if even the proponents of whiteness understand that it does not pertain to actually existing human bodies, to be anti-whiteness is just to oppose the construct of human hierarchy as here, not to discriminate against any actual group of people. When Fanon spoke of the world of statues, he understood that statues are the materialization of whiteness, its only pure material condition and its state of mind. Whiteness, as a statue, is the icon of the singular self, which acts as if it was the being of being human. It then builds walls, borders, and boundaries to keep what it thinks is the savage world outside at bay. And there's long history here from the segregated towns of colonial Mexico in the 15th and 16th century to the wall that kept out the indigenous Lenape in New York that still keeps the name Wall Street, to today's Fortress Europe, whose purpose would be entirely clear to any conquistador. Racialization, the making of race, was produced by this segregation, rather than pre-existing races being separated. In Paris, for example, they still call the white people who live inside the wall the intramuraux, and those outside are the extramuraux, segregated and made secondary. Now, coloniality uses triangulation as a way of seeing, quite literally. Triangulation is the means of surveying land, of navigation, and of targeting weapons. It's a practical application of colonial visuality, the rendition of lived experience into geometry, segregating and targeting at once. The framed visual space imagined by 17th century settler colonialism that ended up later in photography was a single point perspective created as here, I hope you can see just about. There's a pyramid of light entering the eye from a plot on the ground. But for the colonist, that plot could then be drawn and claimed as the ownership of land that could be was taken by force and could now be worked. Today, that triangulated visualizing is epitomized by what the drone operators call the kill box. So I'm showing you here an example of this. This is a drone. This is the area on the ground it can, as it were, see, and that means that they can kill people in that area. So they call it the kill box. Such visualizing forms what I call the hostile visual environment. And I'm appropriating here the nasty little British government slogan. This environment is always subject to surveillance and visualized control by the triangulating gaze of the police officer, automated by the scan of a passport, or the taking of fingerprints. It's the saturation surveillance of everyday life by CCTV, the drone feed that enables remote killing, and the spread of facial recognition software from fancy phones to public surveillance in everyday life. Nowhere is this hostile visual environment more apparent than at the border, which is now everywhere. In Europe, as many of you will know, the Eurodac database records fingerprints and facial imagery of asylum seekers. It is now the border. This is a Eurodac set of fingerprints above here. Asylum seekers have told me that wherever your fingerprints are taken, there is where you must apply for asylum. So since 2003, Eurodac has recorded the fingerprints of asylum seekers to allow fingerprint comparison evidence as automatic identification system for administering those claims. Since 2015, it also allows law enforcement to cross-check against criminal and so-called terrorist databases. Now, with the capacity to hold 7 million records, Eurodac had already stored 4 million records by 2016. In that year, 1.6 million fingerprints were taken, but the system only generated hits, or cross-references, in 16% of the cases, which suggests that its function is much more to deter than to detect. If statues, monuments, and museums are archaic systems of data collection, then obviously databases are the infrastructures of what you might call the future perfect, those that will have become hegemonic unless there is action taken to prevent them. The servers in the data centers that produce cloud computing are actually known to designers as white space. Gemalto, the software company that administers the EU fingerprint system, directly acknowledges its debt to Francis Galton, the 19th century founder of eugenics and biometry, on its website. It even quotes Galton on the accuracy of the fingerprint. A German stock photograph that I'm showing you below here, it's the kind of thing that you can buy to illustrate your newspaper article, shows the Eurodac imaginary. And you have a hand clad in a medical glove, presumed white, to guard against infection, and it presses another visibly brown hand onto the scanner. The meaning is that brown people are a source of contamination and cannot be distinguished except by machines. Eurodac's administration considers it to be a living system. If it is alive, it's a privatized zombie designed by Kafka. An asylum seeker incarcerated in Denmark described it this way. You're in a room, trying to get out, and it's like a labyrinth to get out of there, with lots of different corridors to take, and you don't know which one. Now, following what turned out to be the high point of migration to Europe in 2015, Eurodac was enhanced so as to take an additional biometric identifier, a facial image, and it lowered the age of taking fingerprints to 6 years old. Are 6-year-olds terrorists? Perhaps, say Eurodac, because they may have overstayed and acted irregularly in crossing internal EU frontiers. As a result, legal experts are now debating quite seriously whether school photographs are private information or public and may be scanned for state use. However, the European Court of Human Rights has already ruled that any retention of biometric data is an intrusion on the right to privacy. Never mind, says the EU, fingerprints and facial images are not biometric data until they undergo specific technical processing. In short, Eurodac presumes asylum seekers to be liars, while it manifestly breaches its own human rights law. How can this hostile visual environment be resisted? Now, if visualizing triangulates, it does so in straight lines. Undoing it, what I'm calling devisualizing, reconfigures seeing as a series of events. Now, the phrase way of seeing was first coined in 1951 by this man, George Lamming. He's a Barbadian writer, and in the midst of negotiating what he termed his exile in London, he presented at a poetry reading at the newly founded Institute for Contemporary Arts in London. Lamming was greeted with oddly loud applause that he took to be an indication that his blackness had been noticed. Next up was the East End Jewish radical poet, Emanuel Litvinov, here, who presented this poem, which is called To T.S. Eliot. And it attacks Eliot's anti-Semitism, which it connects directly to the Holocaust. And there was an immediate uproar. Famous poet Stephen Spender jumped up to defend Eliot by means of noting his own partly Jewish descent. And at that moment, Lamming saw how the anti-colonial way of seeing operates. Lamming, from Barbados, subject to nearly 400 years of colonial ordering and governing, watches Litvinov, traumatized by the Holocaust, but visible to the English elite only as a disruption, and a space emerges. The hegemonic gaze forms a single screen between the subject and itself. Against that simple geometry, the serial way of seeing, produced by the psychic and physical experiences of displacement, breaks the frame. Writing after the 1958 racist violence in Notting Hill, the photographs from the period that I'm showing you here, a neighborhood in London, in which Teddy boys attacked black British people, and in 1959, a man called Kelso Cochrane was murdered in the same neighborhood. Seeing all of this, Lamming condensed time and remapped London to see that the ICA is a neighbor of Notting Hill. Now, in fact, on the ground, it's 4 miles away, and these events were separated by 8 years in time. But in anti-racist realism, like Fanon at the same period, who he knew and he met, Lamming saw that racism and anti-Semitism index and intensify each other. Other West Indians in London also experienced this way of seeing, including the young Stuart Hall, who went on to found cultural studies. Hall followed his white students from the lowest level of British secondary education as they joined in the racist violence in Notting Hill. He realized that the contradiction of a new consumer youth culture amongst teenagers, designated as failures at the age of 14, made their exclusion real to them and produced racism. Yet he did not castigate them. Britain's conservatism in 1959 was, in Hall's telling phrase, anti-life, and so incapable of democracy. It lacked a culture adequate to that reality. Now, those ideas written 60 years ago apply all too well today, where the hyper-wealthy are rigorously divided and segregated from the rest of us, especially from migrants and minorities, for example, in Notting Hill, where the elite are on one side, and on the other you have the site of the terrible Grenfell Tower fire, in which 72 people died in 2017, many of them migrants, including the Ghanaian British photographer Khadija Say, whose work was at that time, at the moment of her own death, on display at the Venice Biennale. And indeed, the US sociologist Ruth Glass coined the very term gentrification as a result of her research in 1950s Notting Hill. Within a few years, it had so separated out London that encounters of the kind recorded by Lamming no longer took place. But that's really nothing compared to what's happening now. I don't think you can even really call it gentrification anymore. so much as something like oligarchification, that makes any sense to non-English speakers, the production of spaces for oligarchs. So the counterpoint to the formation of the young, urban, networked global majority has been the transformation of imperial cities into global cities. The global city is networked to other global cities, not the nation in which it's located. From Shanghai to Johannesburg and New York, the global city has recolonized itself, creating a literally gilded center with super tall buildings for the spectacularly wealthy, surrounded by extended zones of racialized hypersegregation and poverty. In all of this fracturing transformation, long ignored colonial era monuments and museums have become newly visible, the old colonialism standing in for the new. There's no symbolic form for dispossession in the global city. There's no location that can be occupied to stop its spread. The super tall skyscrapers reach to 90 stories, and they offer their clients what their own promotional material calls private sanctuary. Protesting monuments and museums, as I've been doing for the last several years, is an act of reverse appropriation, to try to make that exclusion visible and to open the possibility for future democracy. Consider how Gillian Waring subverted her own monument to Millicent Fawcett. That's here. Fawcett was the president of something called the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, and that helped women gain the vote in Britain in 1918. Fawcett is the only woman represented in Parliament Square, London. She's surrounded by generals. Now, Waring's monument is studiously historical, as commissioned, exactly depicting the fabrics in Fawcett's clothing, with the avowed goal of lasting for centuries. But Waring also has Fawcett carrying a sign, and it reads, "Courage calls to courage everywhere." The words come from Fawcett's obituary for Emily Davidson. And this is her statue here. She was a suffragette also, and she fatally threw herself under the King's horse at the Derby, it's a horse race in Britain, in 1913. Davidson had undergone forced feeding as a prisoner. She had attempted suicide to call attention to that practice. Her martyrdom was an intensely visible moment in the militant suffrage direct action campaign of 1912 to 14, in which they set postboxes on fire, bombed cricket pavilions and country houses, and attacked famous artworks. When the police raided the studio of the suffragette artist Olive Hockin, I'm showing you here, a painter, a fairly average painter actually, but she had attacked a house belonging to the Prime Minister, Lloyd George. And they found in her studio the following items: wire cutters, fire lighters, hammers, bottles of corrosive fluids, 5 false motor car plates, and strips of ribbon bearing the slogans, "No votes, no telegraph connections." That's quite a list. It targets white masculine culture and communications as the infrastructure of white heteropatriarchy. This suffragette militancy puts present-day activist art with its banner drops, leaflets, and sit-ins into some perspective. That militancy is in Fawcett's saying. It sets the suffragette slogan, "Dare to be free," alongside and against the Enlightenment motto, "Dare to know," which was often not very daring. And all of that is encoded by Waring into her piece For Those That Know. But it's still much harder to decode than, say, Sylvia Pankhurst, the suffragette leader, throwing a rock at the portrait of the Speaker of the House of Commons because he had undermined the women's suffrage bill. And I would argue that that's the future to get back to. Now, it won't be monuments that do it. It's time to break whiteness's frame, to engage historically unresolved grief with historically unexpunged hopes for liberation, to make anti-racism visible by what is done, to overwrite the aesthetics of respect for the established order with the serial aesthetics of multi-screen displacement, from gentrification to forced migration. Now that serial aesthetics is everyday life. In a world where 1.6 billion smartphones create 400 hours of YouTube video every minute, 3.5 billion snaps to Snapchat every single day, and 1.2 trillion photos a year. So the work of these screens is to realize the series of what it would take to see every person as fully and levelly human in properly global and polyvocal terms. It's not easy. Spectres walk the earth. The time is out of joint. But on the other hand, Boyce is finally right. Everyone is now an artist. And the artists are prefiguring how this experience across multiple screens can realize anti-racism. Now, these experiments take place outside the art market in spaces like this one. And I just want to end by showing you a couple of spaces that I've been involved in. Here in the Community Justice Center for refugees in Copenhagen called Trampoline House. And I'm showing it during the exhibition Decolonizing Appearance, which I happen to have the opportunity to curate for its Center for Art Migration Politics. Now this space, Trampoline House, offers refugees and migrants the things that the Danish state denies them, from legal advice to language classes, nutritious food, and simply something to do. So I'm showing you here a piece by the Caribbean Danish artist Jeanette Ehlers, and she created a two-channel video installation called The Gaze. On the right, a group of asylum seekers from Trampoline House, here, are kneeling and they look out at the viewer. At intervals, each would stand and walk out, only to reappear on the left-hand side. And so hyper-real was this shot that you could see the reflection of the camera in their eyes. Each looked out for a long moment. Many seemed to tear up. At the very end, a woman says, "We are here because you were there." Now this phrase, it's a telling condensation, migration, imperialism, and diaspora, was first made by A. Sivanandan, who was the editor of the UK journal Race and Class in the 1980s, and from there it spread very widely across British and Caribbean cultures. Its multi-site polyvocal realism disperses the hostile visual environment. To white people it says, "You already left a long time ago and came where we were. Now we remain with and alongside you." This piece, The Gaze, itself looked across at this one by the Ghanaian British artist John Akompra. It's called Utopian Palimpsests, and it's a photographic installation. Like Lamming, Akompra serially mapped fugitivity across time and space, showing, amongst other things, the 17th century tombstones of Sephardic Jews in Barbados, alongside reenactments of migrations by Huguenots fleeing persecution in France and present-day migrations from Iraq. Displaced, multi-screen, a serial realism across time between grief and hope. This then is anti-racist visual activism. And it's reaching some unexpected places. At the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, which is a bastion of colonial appropriation at the very heart of empire. The exhibition learned, which is still up, if you happen to have the opportunity to go to the UK, it's on until the end of November, displays art, photographs, and material objects from the migrants' camp at Calais, better known as the Jungle, which was destroyed by the French government in 2016. So all the exhibits in the show were made or found by people who had been there, and everything is alone. The museum will keep none of it. Events were held in the space with migrants and other activists. I'm showing you here this flag that was made on site by migrants. It depicts 4 past and present zones of British colonial intervention. Most of the migrants came from former British colonies, and they were hoping to live where they could speak the language and have community. But as one migrant noted, they would work for South Asians in the UK, not the English. On the bottom, I'm showing you here, and it's rather tiny, I hope you can pick it out, a photograph by the photographer Julien Pitinhomme, and he's showing here then a migrant defiantly waving a British flag at the UK border in France that was created by the hostile environment. In the UK itself, that gesture, waving a Union Jack, as they call their flag, would declare support for those policies, which are busy sending British people of Caribbean descent from George Lamming's generation of the 50s and 60s back to countries where they have not lived for over 50 years, whilst attempting to create a psychogeography in which the country is not in Europe. They have not managed to answer the question yet where it is, but they want to say that it is not in Europe. Vans were sent into in the areas where migrants were presumed to live, like this one here, and the caption on that van says, "Go home or face arrest." The political imagery aimed at those claiming whiteness purports to tell it like it is, a racist realism. And these then are the stakes. Can an anti-racist visual activism find a way to repurpose former colonial institutions like the museum and to shape a way of seeing that expresses the will to hospitality? Or does the present racist, hostile visual environment continue to dictate a phantasmatic will to power? Those are the questions. It will be up to us to answer them. Thank you so much for spending the time on this beautiful evening to listen to me.